So the first image we're going to start with is a street portrait. Now I underexposed this image, but as you can see there is a little clipping in the highlights. So what I'm going to do now is first crop the image, and I'm going to go to a 16:9 crop. I'm going to bring up the exposure some to about, let's try 130. Sometimes it's easier to physically enter in the number you want rather than sliding the slider. You know, once you get to a sort of a point you like it, then to really fine tune it, it helps to just type it in. And then I'm going to raise the contrast, not much, just to about 5. I'm going to bring up the shadows to about 30. That's usually where I bring up the shadows to about 30. Sometimes I'll bring them up to about 40, but for this one, 30. Now I'm going to raise the texture to about 10. And then go to tone curve. Now I start with the first adjustment here, this first circle, and I'm going to raise the lights to about 7, a little over 5, maybe 8. And then I'm going to drop the darks. -5 looks fine. And then I'm going to raise the shadows up a bit. Okay, now I'm going to go to the second adjustment in the tone curve, and I'm going to put a control point here in the middle. And I'm going to put for the input 128 and the output 128, so it's perfectly centered. Now I'm going to add 2 control points here on the for the darks and 2 for the lights. So for now, I'm not going to do too much adjustment on them. I'll come back to this after I start to add the radial masks. I'm going to adjust the feather. I don't want so much feathering for this. I'm going to bring it up about a whole stop. And now I'm going to add another radial. Just for the face. I'm going to bring this one up about a half a stop. I'm going to raise the clarity because the focus is on the face. So to bring out the eyes a bit more, I'm going to add another radial gradient because the hat's casting quite a bit of a shadow in that area. Bring this up about a quarter of a stop. So I'm going to add 2 more radial gradients. Put one here for this hand. And the arm. This one I'm going to bring up probably almost a full stop. Then I'm going to duplicate this one and bring it over to the other arm and hand here. There's this icon here next to this eye, and you hit that and you hit duplicate mask. And then I can drag and drop or just drag it over here and then adjust the size. Of these radial gradients, once I go back into the tone curve, I may adjust them further if things start to look too dark or too light. But for now, I'm going to leave it as it is. Now I'm going to bring down the blacks for both of these arms and hands here. Okay, for now, I'm going to go back into the tone curve. Now for black and white mix here, I'm going to raise the reds. This will bring out the face and the skin. And I'm going to bring up the orange, so I will do the same. Yellow, I'm going to bring down some. Green, there's nothing really green in this image. A little bit in the chair. And then I'm trying to darken up the chair a bit, so I'm bringing down the aqua and the blue. I'm going to bring it down too, and it will make some of this design stand out a little more. Now in detail, for most pictures, I usually move the amount of sharpening to about 50. And I bring the radius, sometimes I'll leave it at 1.0. For this one, I'm going to bring down to 0.9. Sometimes I'll bring it to 0.8. 0.9 looks fine for this one. In order to see what you're doing, you would hold the Alt or Option key and move the little slider, and then you can get an idea of what you're affecting. Same thing with detail. You can hold the Alt key, and I'm going to raise the details up to about 40. Just when I start to see more of the outline, it looks pretty good at around 40. And then masking, same thing. And then I'm going to go to transform and hit guided. I had perspective control turned on my camera, so now I just need to adjust the crop a bit. I'm going to make this a little bit more of a letterbox, so I unlock the lock icon and just bring out the sides just a bit more. Now I'm going to add a vignette, and I'm going to put it at about -7. That looks, since we adjusted the curves and we made the image a bit darker and brought out more of the contrast, we're starting to see that, you know, there's more to do with the radial gradients. So for the arms, I'm going to bring those up some. I'm going to get rid of some of the feather. I don't want to bring out the face too much because I want to be true to the way the lighting was there. However, I still have to bring up the face, otherwise it's just too much in the shadow. But I don't want to do it too much, otherwise it looks unnatural. So that looks good there. Now I'm going to tone down some of these highlights in the chair behind him, also in the beard and in the shirt. Some of the highlights, they're not blown, but there is more detail that can be brought out. And like I say, I'm just going to be brushing where the lights are, where I feel I can get more detail. You can see all the details coming out. And then it's just a matter of always fine-tuning. You know, you look at the image a bit more and then you think, well, certain areas could be brought up a bit more in terms of the exposure to make them stand out a bit better. I'm actually going to add another radial gradient right in here to make these fingers stand out a bit better. There we go. The face looks like it could use maybe just a bit more exposure, brought up a bit more. So that's about it for this image. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so this one I should have underexposed a bit more, but it's okay for this. If I was leaving this as a color image, it's not okay because the red, you have to be really careful with red, especially cars, to really underexpose. Otherwise the red paint just starts to look really weird like it is right in here. Something about color. With black and white, since we're converting it, it's not that big of a problem. Then I'm going to do a 16:9 crop. I'm going to leave the exposure alone in this panel. I'm going to raise the contrast up to about 5, which is where I put the contrast for most of the images. Since it was color, you have that black and white mixing panel where you can kind of add contrast there. You can also raise the exposure because you're just dealing with luminance. You're darkening the luminance for a color, or you're raising it. For texture, I'm going to bring it up to about 10. I like to bring the texture up to about 7 or 10 for most images. Okay, now I'm going to go to the tone curve in the first adjustment, and I'm going to bring up the lights to about 10. Drop the darks a bit, and then raise the shadows. I'm going to do the second adjustment here, and I'm going to add the control points. So I always start in the middle, and like I said in the last one, put the input at 128 and the output at 128. So the control point's right in the middle. And then I add 2 more here, and 2 for the lights. And then it's always up to you how far you want to move these control points, what kind of image you're looking for, how much contrast you want. But it helps these 2 end points at the far bottom corner and the far top corner. If you raise the bottom one up a bit, it gets rid of the clipping in the darks. And then if you drop the one in the top here, if you bring it down, it would get rid of any clipping in the highlights. So that's very helpful to prevent for clipping. Now I'm going to go into the black and white mix. I'm going to bring up the reds just to bring out the color of the car and lighten it up some. And there was some orange in the paint too, so I'm going to bring that up just to kind of match the red. Yellows aren't too important here, so the aqua I'm going to bring up. And same with the blue. And the blue's starting to actually bring up some of these shadows in the interior. It also has an effect on the chrome for cars, but I like what it's doing with the interior. It's bringing up a lot of these gauges and this section in the passenger side, which is working out nice. I'm just going to raise the purple up and the magenta up just a little. Okay, that's it for black and white mix. For this image, I'm not going to do anything with the guided. It just doesn't work out well for this image. I can show you what it does. That can happen sometime. For the vignetting, this image, I don't need to add any vignette. I'm already getting some. So now I can go into the mask section here, and I'm going to add that radial gradient, and I'm going to focus on the interior. Now I'm going to bring out this panel here, and I'm going to hit the icon that's next to the eye, and I'm going to intersect the mask with a luminance range, because I only want to affect the darks. I don't want to affect the lights so much here. So I'm going to click in the dashboard area here, and basically it just changed the way, you know, exactly what I'm going to affect. So really that looks about the best, just to really focus on the darks. So I'm going to raise the exposure almost a stop, or about a full stop. And then you can turn it on and off to see what you've done. I'm going to move the luminance range a bit because I'm not getting too much of an effect with it at the deep darks there. Okay, that looks better. So you can just sort of change this point for your luminance range. Okay, now I'm going to add another radial gradient. And I'm going to focus on the steering wheel. Okay, and I'm going to raise this not too much, just maybe almost a quarter of a stop. I'll bring up the highlights a bit, just to make this area stand out. Bring up the whites. And then since this is the main focus point of the image, I'm going to raise the clarity a bit. I usually don't bring the clarity anywhere past 7 with pretty much all of my images. I'll always stay around 7, maybe 3 or 5, somewhere in that range. Now I want to drop the luminance in the paint in this section right in here with the brush tool. So the reason I'm not going to drop the luminance for this section of the paint in the black and white mix is because I don't want to affect the entire red of the paint in other sections, just a secluded area. And I'm going to bring down the exposure to about a quarter of a stop. And I'm going to bring down the shadows a bit, and I'm going to add a little dehaze and then just paint on those changes. Then sometimes I go back in the tone curve and I adjust the lights and the darks a bit more. And that's it for this image.